Hey everyone, thanks for coming back to our Startup Scaffold podcast, the news edition. So each week we dissect one or two of the top construction industry stories and then contextualize it to the construction tech environment. And this week we have Curtis, who is a partner at Brick and Mortar Ventures. And as he was saying just before our call, he doesn't usually do podcasts because of everything he's doing is pretty top secret. But for this one, he's come on for us. The big news this week is the US Department of Energy is doing a funding cut for 4 of the 7 hydrogen hubs that were selected under a $7 billion program under the Biden administration. And to give you some quick context, what a hydrogen hub is it's just this regional network of hydrogen producers, consumers, and infrastructure that's designed to facilitate the production, storage, transportation, and the use of clean hydrogen. So it's really about starting this market. And they wanted to create a national clean hydrogen network that could help to decarbonize industries like heavy transportation, with construction and cement plants included in that. So I wanted to start off this conversation with you, Curtis, and really framing it from how real is this push for net zero, especially as it relates to the construction company.
So thanks for having me. The pure hydrogen investors that I know struggled to fundraise, and they knew that this hydrogen hub thing wasn't working out. And then a lot of the major stakeholders in the whole hydrogen push were transportation OEMs. So let's say Toyota and Hyundai both created fuel cell plants. Toyota has somewhat of a contentious relationship with Toyota North America. So you can't buy fuel cells from Toyota. You have to buy a Miura and take it apart to get the fuel cell to integrate it to something. Hyundai has a wiser approach, and they realize we're going to have to integrate these fuel cells into lots of different vehicles, not just consumer transportation vehicles, passenger vehicles. And so that is what I think is happening. The technology works, but the logistics really hurts the economics. And my friends who are professionals in hydrogen companies that are profitable and very large, they say that all their customers have pipelines from the hydrogen production to where it's consumed, and they'll deliver a cryogenically stored hydrogen really just while the pipeline's being built. So there's, as far as I understand, there's really not an economical model for hydrogen that doesn't involve a pipeline. Yeah. So that's at a broader scale, that's some of the kind of economic rules that we believe. And then we're looking as hydrogen as a potential technology for refueling medium and heavy duty cycle assets in really remote areas where, the cost of a gallon of diesel is going to be so high that there's a willingness to try something else. And then there's just parts of the world where they're a lot more progressive, like Norway and Western Australia and some other places.
Yeah. So just to contextualize that to construction a little bit more, what you're saying is we probably won't see hydrogen refueling like petrol stations, if that makes sense, similar to what we see with gasoline because of the pipeline costs, unless we can get pipeline infrastructure. And then you're saying in certain remote locations where you can cryogenically store hydrogen and deliver it, that's where it becomes interesting. Because I assume in those locations, electrification and the delivery of electricity is actually also very challenging.
There's a lot of smart people working on all different parts of the problem. And what I think could work is, and I think they're kind of waiting on the clients to explicitly ask for this, is what I think could work is in the California market, the big contractors already know that 60 to 80% of their emissions in the construction phase are from the vehicles sitting in the parking lot. In that parking lot is likely a job site trailer, and that's running off of temporary power, as is the crane and the rebar bending and various other things. And so they may or may not have an abundance of power, and very unlikely they have charging infrastructure. So the plug-in hybrids and electric cars that are in that lot are unlikely to have somewhere to charge. And be really easy to meter if there was charging infrastructure on that lot. And I would not expect a contractor to be confident in charging infrastructure if it wasn't refuelable. They wouldn't want to give up the power that's going to the crane and the rebar bending and the office trailer to charge electric vehicles in the parking lot. So I think hydrogen could work in that context. And, there's some really great companies out there like Zero Emissions Industries, and they came out of Sandia National Labs at Lawrence Berkeley. So they have a lot of experience with hydrogen. And to them, at least, it's a completely solved problem for refueling operations and leaks and storage and fuel cell procurement, installation. They can fully design, build, commission their own hydrogen assets. And now they're interested in a hydrogen fuel cell genset because the same cost as a diesel one, but depending on the circumstances, it could be a higher cost of fuel. I think it could be economical. And if a client in California was asking their contractor to reduce emissions by over 50%, I think it could be an easy button because there's already green hydrogen at the ports in the Bay Area. I think it'd be in other places in California. So I think it's absolutely possible. It would just take a demand signal from the clients. But it's, as far as I understand, it's a pretty low hanging fruit, and just a few more ducks have to get in a row for it to be possible.
Yeah. So you're saying hydrogen is potentially more likely than, well, not potentially more likely, but it is a very viable alternative to, I guess, charging infrastructure and battery electricity infrastructure? Or is it, in my head, is the hydrogen somehow recharging these batteries, or is it hydrogen directly to a hydrogen fuel cell? Because there's a little bit of complexity there, because you're telling me the vehicles aren't necessarily hydrogen fuel cells. So how are we getting this hydrogen to the car, if that makes sense?
There's a lot of people that already own electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. I think that a company that provides hydrogen to a construction parking lot could also sell to the contractor of a fleet of Miras. I could buy a Mira for $15,000 with very little miles on it. And I could see a contractor being quite pleased with that cost of a reliable vehicle from Toyota and the certainty that it's completely green hydrogen, and I'm getting carbon credits if I'm set up to do that type of stuff. But it is complicated. I mean, the cooling of a hydrogen system is a big consideration. So you're seeing it in very quiet boats, and boats really don't have a cooling problem. So I think it's all going to be kind of hybrid. There's going to be a battery in the system, and it's going to be an engineered solution, but I don't think it's going to be anything too challenging. One of our portfolio companies did build the first hydrogen-powered residential home in California, and it had an 18-inch thick blast wall between the home and the neighbor. So, there are considerations and I think some of these hydrogen tanks in Miras and other vehicles make for good explosives from drones. So there's a lot of energy in there, and they're very lightweight. But anyway, we gather a lot of our understanding of the market from adjacent industries because, we really leaned into net zero for construction because one of our LPs let us know that they were leaning into that market. And that was a big enough of a signal for us to allocate the time to try to get smart on it. Yeah.
I think if we look at net zero today, right? Because I think hydrogen is still a bit further away. And even in the last couple of years, we've seen interest in electric gensets and even some more EVs that are coming onto construction sites. And I know that, we had discovered one of the big challenges, and Curtis, like you mentioned, is the charging and refueling, or do battery swaps. Or what we've seen is some of these electric gensets were actually getting recharged by diesel generators, which in some sense really just doesn't make any sense at all, because it's thought the whole point of it was to try to be green, right? But then you're kind of just adding another thing kind of in that supply chain in some sense. So yeah, I'm kind of curious, as it is today, what can we do to get in the US context, right? Because I think in Norway it's very different, and Jan has, he's been spending a lot of time looking at full kind of net zero job sites. But today, what can we do?
Sure. So I really like the idea of a battery being charged by a diesel engine, especially if you can upgrade the emissions system on that engine and capture the carbon and meter that capturing, and then sequester that carbon in concrete. So if you're doing concrete operations on a project and you've got some way of capturing the carbon coming out of the diesel generators, then you can put that into the concrete. And that's something that innovative contractors are doing. And there's no reason why you can't do that. I mean, it's not a common thing, but it's possible. And a hybrid diesel genset, a hybrid diesel vehicle, it's usually more of the large scale mining equipment and diesel locomotives and, all types of vehicles and vessels. Edison Motors is a great company. It's a personal investment of mine that is really in like forestry and not really construction tech, but, it makes just all the sense in the world to have electric drive for something that needs a lot of torque, and then a diesel generator. And then these Scandia motors, they have such high compression ratios that they don't need the DEF fluid and all the really, poorly thought out emissions systems that go on diesel engines. It doesn't make any sense to reduce the longevity of the engine just to reduce emissions. Now you're just wasting an engine block.
It's really interesting because it sounds like you're saying there's a fragmented future. And what I mean by that is right now we have a primary fuel source and a primary kind of motor capability that we're leasing from fleet operators. But in the future, you're saying, depending on your project context, you're going to either use some kind of hydrogen fuel cell or some kind of electrification fuel cell. You've almost got to map this entire way of how you're going to build out your microgrid. So is really the opportunity actually being the designer of the microgrid, or being the designer of, hey, I'm a construction company. I tell you where my project is. I tell you what I need to meet from an emission standpoint. And someone is designing, these are all the pieces that you need to go into play. And that system integrator is an opportunity that's there.
I'd say we don't know, because the economics is complicated. You don't want to just fixate on the cost of fuel and then end up with a giant maintenance bill, or, it's just all of these considerations. And, running hydrogen through a combustion engine, that's an option. I mean, gasoline, when you combust it, is a gas. And so there's some really good things about petrochemicals from a standpoint of all these different particles that can help with like the sealing of the combustion chamber, and natural lubricants. When they took sulfur out of diesel, that really reduced the natural lubrication of it. But there's some benefits to it. So it's kind of an idea, but it'd be interesting to have a recirculation system from the emissions that can separate the ash from the soot and kind of take the good contaminants and put them back into the intake to help with sealing of the combustion chamber and lubrication, and then just add hydrogen to that, and then capture any of the bad exhaust from the combustion chamber. There's no reason why a combustion engine couldn't be an option, especially with how many people are trained in maintenance of those systems. If it has to be economical, and also there's different tools for different jobs. And some of the really great things about fuel cells is the low thermal signature, and it's silent. I know that a lot of people who have piloted, or like in the film industry, they use a lot of battery systems. They've fallen in love with silent power. And so that's something now that they're really interested in. Maybe we'll see a client in California or a regulator at the permits requiring silence, or a contractor says, hey, we can get a lot more work done if we're using silent power, and have another shift in the day. So there's other benefits to the technology for batteries and fuel cells and some of these things than just the emissions, because it's also like a industrial ergonomics thing, and fatigue and safety. But I mean, I remember our old office in South Park, somehow someone got a permit to, jackhammer concrete right outside of our door. And it's like normal working hours. And it's like, how the heck did y'all get a permit? No, this is bananas.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So then, to you as an investor, taking a step back, where you're making these highlights on some of the technical challenges, but then also the challenges with how to design and implement these systems, like on a meta level, where do you really see the pain point, and where do you see your capital potentially, or your relationships, providing value and an impact? So if you were looking at investing, where do you really start to focus it? This future feels very uncertain and very fragmented from what you're saying.
Sure. So we're agnostic to technology, business model. We're just focused on construction anywhere in the world. Has to be something that we believe could be a venture, a trajectory. And so we took a look at the pure battery replacement for gensets, and we just weren't convinced on the logistical side. And then also just hardware, your first production run is guaranteed to have issues. So, just really being oriented to scale and put as much money to work as possible, as fast as possible. We just know that's not the right idea for hardware. That's not how you plan for success. We bring our managing director a lot of deals that we think might be pushing the limits on the definition of construction tech. And that's really Darren Bechtel's, one of his functions as managing director is to draw that line of, hey, this is construction tech and this is not. And he likes to be challenged on that. And he wants to know, maybe this is a little outside of, our focus, but we're seeing what's going on in an adjacent market. Look at the film industry. They have a lot of tax credits and a lot of government involvement in what they do. And they have a lot of clients who are really interested in net zero, and they love silent power. And so they're a great kind of early market for some of that technology. There's a lot of other uses for hydrogen in other industries and defense and others. And so, we'll spend our time learning about that, get in front of a lot of great deals, and then end up having to pass because, that's not construction tech yet, but we're still earning a seat at the table, helping them, making introductions. They get to know our LPs. We maintain a good view of the landscape and also an appreciation of when does construction tech or when do construction stakeholders become a good customer for this technology? Because the early adopter may not be construction. Agriculture already has a lot of institutional knowledge of how to handle ammonia safely. And, ammonia as a fuel source for agriculture makes a lot of sense. Now you try to power a boat with ammonia and it's in the news that, the person responsible for the safe operation of a port is not going to let you start refueling and doing large amounts of ammonia transfers just because you want to. If it's not a port designed for large quantities of ammonia, they're not going to let you have a bad day.
Really interesting. And I think something that you highlighted is you're looking at adjacent industries and understanding the technology landscape to determine when your LPs or early construction stakeholders will actually be ready to adopt those technologies. So have you noticed any patterns with that? Because writing on the newsletter, I find it incredibly challenging to define what is a construction tech startup versus what isn't a construction tech startup. And I've known from talking to you that you look at a lot of military tech, a lot of logistics tech, and then bring it to your LPs. So how do you do that? And what is your process for doing that? Is it starting from these pain points? And then at what point is construction ready for it? How do you make that call?
I'm thinking a good example is Trucks Hub. Alice, if you want to tell a little bit about that, it's not net zero, but it kind of illustrates that point.
No, I was actually thinking, Curtis, a good example is actually advanced navigation on price point, right? So I think we look at all of these different industries for the best tech, and all of these industries have big R&D budgets. They have likely a lot of government funding that's going into heavy R&D, right? And a lot of the early adopters of these technologies are going to be in these adjacent industries that have a lot of money to spend on new hardware tech or deep tech or whatnot. And frankly, for construction, our margins are low and we just don't have the capacity to be able to spend a ton of money on certain types of sensors and technologies. So I think for construction, it really does kind of depend on what is the problem that this technology is solving and what is the price point of that solution. And if that price point makes sense for construction, then we can definitely help with go-to-market into the construction industry.
Sure. So for advanced navigation, we had identified unsolved problem in construction being GPS-denied dynamic metallic environments. And that just being really hard to do surveying. And there's a lot of survey busts out there, quality control issues. And we thought that gyroscopes and, algorithms for reducing drift from other industries could be really beneficial. So we did advanced navigation, and they are a leader in supplying components to surveying companies. So if you've got a quadcopter with LiDAR, or you're doing some kind of geophysical data collection, stuff like that, advanced navigation is very possibly supplying MEMS gyroscopes or fiber optic gyroscopes in that equipment to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible. We were thinking that technology could be really great for like a rover. So if you've ever done any like large earthwork projects, those GPS domes on a rod with a data collector on it, a rover, that's huge for a large, earthwork contractor. As now, as an engineer in the field, I don't have to file a survey request to go and shoot points. I can just walk around and shoot my own points. And for a commercial contractor to have a field engineer walking around being able to do their own layout, that'd be tremendous, because you don't typically need a full scan of everything. It's like, I need to shoot a couple points, top a pipe. I need to shoot a couple of points. And then from that, I can draw roughly the shape of what it is and create the as-built and all that stuff. And then on StruxHub, I was really just trying to illustrate the point of, they came out of a great lab with Wholesome Cement focused on urban commercial. And then we just made introductions into the industrial and infrastructure space and got the demand signal. And they said, yes, we would love to have this level of a solution for logistics coordination, and infrastructure and industrial just doesn't get nearly as much attention as commercial. So it just made all the sense in the world for an investment of, let's fund this company to build a go-to-market team to be able to go to these other market segments. And that's one of the great things about construction. As long as you go where the work is and are active in multiple markets, these are markets that are either uncorrelated or inversely correlated. So, as one commercial, like the bottom falls out, well, if you're in the business of industrial and infrastructure, you could be doing, quite well. Very similar to with, Cumulus Digital Systems and us financing them to go into the data center market. And now they're rocking and rolling.
Is that common amongst VCs? Because what it's reminiscent of is our innovation team on one of our projects would get problem statements from our business, then do these really extensive market scans and stitch together different solutions to come together and be like, hey, like this is something now we can use on site. And it sounds like that's how you're approaching it. And an edge that you have is, given your deep industry network, you can provide value to the startup and increase your investment by taking them or helping them to enter a new market that they potentially just don't have that sector expertise. And Alice, if you remember from our conversation with Clifton, that's why he took on the investment from Prologis Ventures, where he was like, yeah, we don't understand the warehousing segment. Let's get this investor who will allow us to understand this market and start to go to market within this industry. So is that really just a really good venture strategy, to find a adjacent startup and then bring it to construction and supercharge it with your network?
Well, it's our strategy. I think a lot of kind of vertically focused firms, there's a lot of great investors in construction tech and, one of these vertically focused ones. And I think they all benefit from the kind of that network and having people on the team who've been in that industry as engineers, things like that. So we call it earning a seat at the table, and we want to help entrepreneurs, even if it doesn't end up being a fit, because we want a good relationship with them, and they could potentially start another company that is a fit, or once what they're doing winds down, they could be a fantastic asset to another one of our portfolio companies or a player in the ecosystem.